Welcome everyone to the last of a three-part webinar series intended to promote ethical and non-extractive research practices. Our goal has been to support researchers and members of our communities more broadly in building capacity toward documenting and preserving our many storied pasts and presents as MENA folks and folks who support MENA folks. We are delighted by the turnout and thank you so much for being with us today. We're also thankful to the Orfalea Center and the Center for Middle East Studies at UCSB for their partnership and support. Beyond this event, Egypt Migrations is also grateful to our donors for their contributions of invaluable historical materials and indebted to financial and in-kind supporters, including the Department of History at York University, community investors, and to those who are working to make the project a success, including the Clara Thomas Archives team, especially Michael Moyer and Katrina Cohen-Palacios. My name is Amy Fayas, and I'm on the Egypt Migrations Board of Directors. I'm a PhD candidate at UC Santa Barbara and current research fellow at the American Research Center in Egypt. I will be introducing our speakers today. Dr. Michael Akladios is a historian and founder and executive director of Egypt Migrations. He attained his PhD from York University and now teaches at the University of Toronto. His research primarily focuses on Egypt's migrants and the global Middle East during the Cold War. And his dissertation, and now first book project, is entitled Ordinary Copts: Ecumenism, Activism, and Belonging in North American Cities, from 1954 to 1992. The study seeks to restore agency to the modern Copts by exploring the varied and at times opposing voices of pragmatic migrants, rather than accept the prevalent condescension in Middle East studies of viewing Copts as an isolated minority, distinguished solely by their group experience. Part of this argument appears in a forthcoming chapter in Dalia Abdelhadi and Rami Ali's edited Routledge Handbook on Middle East Diasporas, forthcoming, or I believe may already be out. Following Dr. Akladios, we have Diogo Bercito, who is a Brazilian journalist and scholar. He worked as a foreign correspondent in Jerusalem and Madrid. In mid-2021, Diogo published the book Brimos, telling the stories of Brazilian politicians of Levantine descent. He is now pursuing his PhD in history at Georgetown University, working on a dissertation about the Arab diaspora of Brazil. As an oral history intern with Egypt Migrations, he produced a series of interviews with first-generation Egyptian migrants in Brazil, most of which arrived during the 1950s. And last but certainly not least, Leila Zonouzi, who is a PhD candidate in global studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her dissertation research is a comparative diasporic study between Iran, Egypt, and Turkey, where she looks at the new wave of academic mass migration from the MENA region to the global north in the 21st century. She currently is the editor of Egypt Migrations. And thank you to all for being here and for sharing your experience. Before we get into today's discussion on oral history methods and best practices, I just wanted to take a few minutes to elaborate on what Egypt Migrations is and what it's about. Since 2016, Egypt Migrations has served as a vehicle for the preservation and promotion of the histories and experience of migrants from Egypt who are contributing to their host societies. The work centers on the identification, acquisition, digitization, and production of very large collections of historical materials, including photographs, papers, diaries, books, oral histories, and other audiovisual materials that illuminate the diverse stories of individuals and groups that make up the collective memory of Egypt's diaspora. Egypt Migrations is a federal not-for-profit based in Canada committed to providing free access to source materials preserved in the first and only Egyptian immigrant archival collection housed at the Clara Thomas Archives and Special Collections at York University. It promotes education through expertly curated exhibitions, digital education resources, and physical events and virtual initiatives. The efforts over the past 6 years have spanned a range of dynamic initiatives that not only enhance Egypt Migration's historic collections and showcase these materials to the international community, but also provoke challenging questions and spark engaging discussions about the realities of Egypt's diasporas. We are currently embarking on an array of exciting initiatives and curating an expansive series of oral history exhibitions. Egypt Migrations just launched their third exhibit, a set of 12 interviews curated by Alia Osman, an undergraduate student at NYU Abu Dhabi, entitled Egypt's Migrants in the Gulf. Please check out the interviews, all moving and deeply insightful as to the in-betweenness and the impermanence of labor migrant experience in the GCC. The initiatives are guided by deep investment in exploring varied and at times opposing voices and move a step beyond the standard practice of single-sided research by producing groundbreaking deliverables across multiple geographies. Egypt Migrations is dedicated to promoting social equity, raising public awareness and interest in Middle East migrants, and providing a long-standing point of reference for educational and social purposes. For us, the importance of preserving the histories of Egypt's diverse migrant communities and showcasing it to the public is more than just a research agenda, it's a passion. Therefore, Egypt Migrations seeks to play a pivotal role in this vision of a vibrant and engaged diaspora, empowered by democratic access to historical knowledge and resources. To that end, we have just acquired Coptic Voice US, a Southern California nonprofit, and are working to integrate this vibrant platform into our many offerings and initiatives. In support of that expansive vision, I invite you all to visit the website at www.egyptmigrations.com. Follow us on our social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And if you find value in any of these offerings, to please consider donating financially and share our initiatives and publications with friends, family, and colleagues. Once again, thank you all for participating in this series. And without further ado, let's begin this exciting discussion of oral history and storytelling, starting with Dr. Akladios.
Thank you so much, Amy, for that introduction and for moderating the discussion. So I don't have slides prepared. I'm just gonna be a talking head for a few minutes. And I'm really hoping that in the Q&A portion, we can pick up on where I left off. And I'd love to hear from you about your own experiences and any particular tips or tricks that I can help with. So the big thing for me that I want to get across, because when we talk about oral history, I mean, you can run 10, 12 workshops on oral history. We can talk about a broad range of ideas, a broad range of practices, and how best to effectively and ethically do our work. But I want to focus in on a couple of important concepts that I feel are vital as an introduction point and a way to think about, okay, how do we now take up the call to collect community stories and to do the work of writing back and to collect counter narratives and to expand and democratize the collections housed at so many archives in our cities and national archives. And to start, I would say that knowing yourself is one of the most important starting points. when we talk about oral history, one of the big terms that you first encounter is positionality, right? Is what is your positionality? Know yourself, know your biases, accept them, write them into your work, know where you're approaching the conversation from, because what differentiates oral history from, doing the work of going into the archives, collecting documents and letters and analyzing them, one of the things that differentiate it is the fact that you're a part of this source now. You're producing, along with your interviewee, a primary source that is then used for research and for exhibition and so on. So you are a part of the story now. Every conversation that you have with this person will be different than if it was conducted by someone else, than if it was conducted at a different time, in a different day, in a different year, because our memory and our conversations and our dialogue is always changing based on our context and on our environment and how much time has elapsed. And so know yourself. What is your positionality? So for me personally, I am a Copt from Egypt. I came here to Toronto when I was 8 years old with my family. And I found myself in need of answers, in need of understanding, okay, what is my family's story? What is my community's story? And it was all inspired by a Canadian history class in 4th year undergrad, where the professor asked us to write about our communities. And then I go digging as a young undergrad, and I discover little stories, interesting stories about my church in Toronto, how it was the first in North America, how the priest that I grew up attending church and listening to was the first priest in all of North America, sent to minister to the Diaspora in its early years in the 60s. And I discover these stories, and then I move forward into my master's, into my PhD, because I want to know more. I want to understand, how did this develop? Why did it develop? What were the challenges that this community faced? And I found myself quite quickly realizing certain demographic features of this early immigrant community, and realizing that I was a middle-class Coptic immigrant studying middle-class Coptic immigrants in North America. And so I was very much an insider, but at the same time, there has to be a balance. You have to bring in a certain training, a certain critical consciousness to the work that you are engaging with. And so I worked really hard to read all the recent literature, to understand what the discussions were that were happening among scholars about how to conduct oral history, what the value is, how to make use of it. And perhaps this is a discussion for another day, to talk about how oral history developed ultimately as it developed as a political goal of changing societies. Right? Oral history, I mean, of course, oral history is not new. Oral stories are not new. Transmitting our experiences orally is not new. But historians began to turn towards oral history really in the 1960s and 1970s as a way to produce counter narratives, to write back against dominant national histories, and to make individuals and their textured narratives part of the story. And that matters. When we engage in this work, when we tell these stories, we are telling stories of people. We are recognizing at the outset that human beings, that people are the foundation of our history, of our stories, of our profession as historians. We cannot be neutral. We cannot feign some form of academic impartiality. We are part of the story. We tell the story in order to better reflect our societies and the problems in our societies, as much as the successes, the contributions of immigrants, as much as the internal tensions. And it was really grappling with all of these issues that led me down the path to what has become, in a sense, my motto, the word that you'll find in every publication I've ever produced, and that's heteroglossia. It came from Bakhtin, it came from literary studies. It's about varying and at times opposing voices, but heteroglossia has become sort of my, the word that best defines what I do and why I do it. It is the word that I feel best encompasses what we do at Egypt Migrations. It's the word that I find is at the heart of my book, which I'm struggling to edit. But anyways, heteroglossia for me is about telling these diverse stories and telling them faithfully. And it's hard at times trying to understand where you have people coming from so many different perspectives, coming from arriving at different times, and their experience vary by gender, by skin tone, by accent, by socioeconomic status. And you are trying to faithfully capture all of that variety and to understand that, you know, the Coptic community or the Egyptian community, or for those who are willing to take on the immense task of writing about the entire Arab immigrant community, you are talking about a diversity, a variety that cannot be covered in any homogeneous narrative that blankets and mutes diversity. And so heteroglossia for me is about that variety, it's about that diversity, and it's about appreciating it and trying to have these voices talk to each other, trying to write a narrative that helps to tell these stories in some form of coherent matter. And it always, for me, comes back to that this is a political goal, that it's not neutral. It will never be neutral for me, I'm sure for many others, because I am intentional in my efforts to collect stories across gender, across class, across sexual orientations and beliefs, and those who are within the community, those who have decided to leave the community, those who find themselves at odds with leaders and those who are ethnic leaders, to try to understand that variety and to write that variety into the study of Copts and into the study of Egypt, but also, and importantly, to then preserve all of these stories at an institutional archive so that it is available to complicate the national history. So that's the big kind of motivation for me. That's where I see the power of oral history, the value of oral history. Narrowing things down a little bit onto like the actual method of oral history, I prioritize at every step of the way, from the pre-interview process to the interview process to the post-interview process, shared authority. And for me, shared authority is about, this is not a process of extraction, it's a process of collaboration, right? This is about working with the individuals that you are in conversation with rather than mining information from them. And so you are preparing for the interview, reading extensively, understanding this person, understanding the history that you want to discuss with them. You are engaging with them equitably and fairly, and you arrive at the interview knowledgeable and awake and alert, and you don't bury your head in a notebook while they're talking. You speak to them face to face, eye to eye, and you listen to their stories and you engage with them. You don't hesitate to share of yourself, because sharing of yourself creates a bond. It allows you to have a conversation, to have dialogue, and that produces richer narratives. And so for me, shared authority and sharing, the act of sharing in the interview space, before the interview, making sure that they are comfortable, that they are aware of what's going to happen, that you have forwarded the consent forms, that they are aware of the ethical protocols you're following, that they understand every line, every sentence in those forms is so important. And trust me when I say it's not going to solve everything. So I know from my own past experience, particularly interviewing Egyptian immigrants who arrived in Canada and the United States in the 1960s, that form and the recorder were such a big elephant in the room, always. That regardless of how much you explain the form, how much you reassure the person, if they have their own past history, if they have their own history with security forces, if they have their own mistrust of government, of forms of signing their name to anything, then that will always be a stumbling block. And that recorder is always there in the room. It is always noticeable to the interviewee. And so what you do matters as an interviewer, having a conversation, sharing of yourself, telling your own stories as they tell you theirs, having prepared adequately so that you are aware of what they're telling you contextually, so that you can engage them in that. And it's one of the great things about oral histories, for me personally, is how the interviewee will often invite you into the story. Will say, oh, I'm sure, well, you're too young, but maybe your parents told you this, or did you know this? And they will make you a part of the conversation, and you shouldn't hesitate to join in, and you shouldn't hesitate to share of yourself. And you should never, ever pretend as if you know everything. You should never, ever just nod along. It is important to say when you don't know and be honest with the person, because you want them to be honest with you. And so a couple of things that I've covered so far is that it's important that oral history as a method serves a political goal. It democratizes access to resources. It provides a way for us to talk back to the archive, to produce resources that are then available for writing richer stories about the nation, about immigrant groups. And it allows for us to engage with the person to produce textured narratives, with the interviewee to produce textured narratives, and to emphasize that variety and that diversity within our communities. And it serves such an important role, in my mind, as I said earlier, for revealing and emphasizing that human beings are the foundation of our stories as historians, as scholars. We are not impartial. We don't exist outside of the events we talk about. We are writing for a reason. You decided when you sat down, whether you are a scholar or a community activist, or you are someone who is trying to embark on gathering, stories within your community. You had a motivation, you had a reason for doing this. And that is your positionality, that is your purpose, that is your bias. You have to own it, you have to accept it, you have to write it into your work, and you have to be aware of it, because otherwise we're not doing credit and we're not being transparent in the work that we're doing. So that's the big thing I wanted to cover. A couple of quick things that I'm just going to wrap up with so I don't take up too much time is when it comes to technology and when it comes to the daunting prospect of doing this work remotely or even in person on a small budget, I can reassure you and say that we have the smallest budget in existence at EM. But we're able to make it work thanks to some really great people and a little bit of technical learning on the job. And so I can say that if you have the budget, getting like a $50 mic and a $60 webcam off Amazon will make a huge difference. Something that is 1080p for the webcam, at least, that will make a huge difference in quality when it comes to Zoom interviews. And a great thing is you can also use something called OBS Studio. It's a program, OBS Studio, and hook up your mic and webcam to your laptop and set up everything and record from there, and take it on the go if you're doing in-person interviews. It is actually significantly cheaper than going and buying a DSLR camera or like a big camera to do the professional interviews. It's never going to match it, but if you're working on a budget, it is a great way to go. And it does come out very well, especially because OBS Studio has so many menus and features that you can tweak, and it's free. It's open access. So that's one thing I wanted to say. Another is make sure that you are very aware of the ethical protocols that you need to follow. You prepare very accessible consent forms. You fill out the information and provide options to your interviewee. So what we do at Egypt Migrations is we give the option of anonymous transcript, audio only, or audio video. And that gives them a level of comfort that they can choose whatever is okay with them. And it does not have to be preserved indefinitely. If they so choose, they can bow out at any time. There is no condition. They're not stuck with anything. This is all for the benefit of the community and in conversation with the interviewee. And we are not there to extract. We are not there to force. We are just there to listen and to amplify these voices. And for the Q&A period, I'm just going to mention right now that there are a bunch of editing programs out there. There are a bunch of post-production programs out there. Off the top of my head, Handbrake is useful for converting video and adding subtitles. HitFilm Express is useful if you don't have a powerful graphics card, but you have a powerful processor. On the other hand, you can use DaVinci Resolve, which is good if you have a powerful graphics card, but not a great processor on your computer. And so these are technical things that I can get into in the Q&A, but I just wanted to mention that there's a lot out there and there are ways around stumbling blocks, whether they be financial or institutional. There are ways around it, and I'd be happy to discuss that later. But just know that the most important thing is that you are honest with yourself and with your interviewee, that you engage equitably, and that you work towards building community stories and talking back against the archive and telling the world that your community matters and their stories matter, and the rest will work itself out.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Ustez. And now we will turn to Diogo, who is coming to us live from the studio.
Thank you, Amy. Let me just put up my notes. Do you mind sharing my? Yeah, thank you. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you for inviting me. I feel very humbled in a way, because although I've been doing oral history for a while, it's something that I'm still learning. I'm still taking coursework. Actually, one of my professors is here with us. And I still have a lot of questions about oral history in general, but I do hope that my brief experience can offer you a few insights, and I'm happy to talk more during the Q&A. But I thought of beginning by talking a little bit about my work as a journalist and how it prepared me or not to do oral history. Then I'll talk about the project that I'm doing with Egypt Migrations, that I did with Egypt Migrations, sorry, when I with them last summer, and how that one project was different from what I was doing as a journalist. And finally, I'll speak briefly about my current and my ongoing projects and the importance of oral histories in general to research. So yeah, I'm first and foremost a journalist, as Amy said before. I've worked with Folha de São Paulo, which is the leading newspaper in Brazil. I've been with them for over 10 years. I was their correspondent in Jerusalem, in Madrid. I traveled all around the Middle East, doing interviews, basically. And I'm still, I quit my job in 2018, the job as a correspondent, but I'm still regularly contributing with them with stories from the US. So I'm pretty much still a journalist. That's what I'm trying to say. And as a journalist, as you know, I was mostly interviewing people. That's the building block of the job. And I was trying to think earlier this week when I was preparing this presentation, and I think I probably did more than 1,000 interviews, if my math is right. So that said, I would have assumed that I was ready for doing oral history. How different could it be doing an interview for oral history than journalism, right? And I think on some degree, I was right that I was ready, at least in terms of knowing how to find people, how to approach people, how to ask questions. I think that although I'm a very shy person, naturally, I'm no longer afraid of sitting down with someone. At least that was kind of my first experience. But then in 2018, as I said, I quit the newspaper. I moved to Washington, D.C. to do a master's in Arab studies at Georgetown. And then I began transitioning from journalism to history in this period. And in this same period, in 2020, I began a PhD in history with a focus on the Middle East, but more generally, or more specifically, Syrian-Lebanese migration to Brazil. And in that moment, I wrote this book that Amy mentioned on Syrian and Lebanese migration to Brazil, which came out last year. And I'm not mentioning the book to advertise it, but because I think it's a good example of something in between journalism and history, and it was the product of that one moment that I felt in between. So it's based in written documents, but also on oral history interviews that I did with migrants and descendants. So here I have a picture, for instance, of this Lebanese lady living in this village in southern Lebanon in the border with Syria. She's holding a picture of the grandfather of Fernando Haddad, which later became a minister in Brazil. He was mayor of São Paulo. So that's kind of one example of one of the interviews I've done for my book. And it's still mostly journalism, but it made me think at that moment of how to take that experience that I had and put it into history. And yes, I've made a lot of mistakes in this process, among them, and probably chiefly of them, not properly recording the interviews. Coming from written journalism, I was happy, having my notebook and just writing down stuff. So I wasn't worried necessarily with audio quality, or I didn't record any video. Some of the interviews I didn't record because I was on the go. I was driving around Lebanon. Sometimes I didn't have my recorder. So that's something definitely I would want to go back in time and change. But overall, I'm happy with the result. So in that particular moment, after I published the book, I got the internship with Egypt Migrations, which for me was the moment in which I finally fully embraced oral history as a method. So basically what I did in my project, I interviewed 10 first-generation Egyptian migrants in Brazil. This time around, I recorded all of them with video and audio. I transcribed all of them. I translated them into English, those that I did in Portuguese. Then Michael Akladios very kindly subtitled them, which must have been a very unpleasant job. And they're now all of them on the website. So you can see here some of the screenshots from the website. And I think it was only then, in that moment, that I understood how different and how difficult it was really to do oral history. First of all, I had to completely change my mindset, something that I'm still in the process of doing. It took me a lot of time to realize that even the work ethics are different when you're transitioning from journalism to oral history. For example, journalism is a very extractive work in the sense that, basically when I'm doing journalism, I'll call someone, either to get information or check information, and then I'll put that on paper basically the way my editor and I see fit, which is not necessarily bad in the sense, that's how journalists uncover secrets from government officials. That's how we hold power accountable, right? That's the public service we provide. And we need this kind of independence, of course, from the sources. But I came to understand that oral history is about something else, right? Like Michael Akladios just said, it's about sharing authority, right? Co-creating a document, co-narrating a story. And that's certainly something that I was not used to. So when I was doing the interviews for the project with Egypt Migration, and I called this man on top, Jacques Sarda, I couldn't just call this 90-year-old Egyptian Jewish migrant, talk to him and do whatever I wanted with the interview, right? The project this time around involved getting him to understand the project, sending him a consent form. I've read his book. He published a memoir, so I've read the whole memoir. I got his signature, and then I recorded the conversation. I shared the video with him, and then only then I published it online, and only with the caveat that he could ask me anytime to take it down, right? To delete it from the website, basically, and take it out of the archive. And I don't know if that's a good example of some of the differences between both works, but some of these things, like showing a story to the interviewee before publishing or taking it down from the website, those are things that would get me fired from the newspaper, from any newspaper, right? They're very against journalism ethics, I guess, but yet they're the good practice when we're talking about oral history, right? So that's for me, I guess, one of the biggest differences. And again, something that I'm still struggling with. I guess there was also some sort of technical learning, as Michael Akladios said, but maybe not related to the differences between journalism and oral history, but to the fact that I came from written journalism. So it took me a lot of trial and error to come up with good audio and good video quality when I was recording the interviews. It took me years to figure out that I actually had access to a studio at the library here at Georgetown, it's the second time I just used this space for the first time on Monday. And I wish I knew that before, right? And I guess all of this is very hard to teach because, some of it requires practice, and it's something that we've been talking a lot about in the course that I'm taking on oral history here at Georgetown. But the one thing I wish I could go back in time and change is my shyness in simply asking interviewees to change their settings. So for instance, I had this case in which I could hear a television in the background of one of the interviews that I was doing. And I just didn't know how to interrupt the person during the recording. I didn't want to record me asking her to turn off the TV. I didn't want her to feel embarrassed. And I just, in the end, I didn't ask her to turn it on. And you can hear in the recording. Something else, and I think it relates to what Michelle Akladios was saying earlier on positionality. So in my first interview with Jacques Sarda, the man on top in the print screens, he asked me if I spoke Arabic because he was mentioning a phrase in Arabic, and I completely froze. As a journalist, I really don't want to be in the interview, right? I don't want to be part of the document. So if you see the recording, I just don't react for 5 seconds, and then I just say yes very coldly, and I keep interviewing him. Which again, I wish I could go back in time and do it differently, because only after that I realized that my presence was already changing the interview, right? I was reading this article recently by Alessandro Portelli, and he says something that really resonates with me, that people actually tell us stories that they think we want to hear, right? And they tell stories to the people they think we are. So it's just, it was kind of very, very silly of me to, just not wanting to be there. And I guess that's why I actually put myself in the print screens, just to make that point. And I'm very proud of the project. I think in part, it speaks to what Michael Akladios was saying earlier about heteroglossia. I'm telling the stories of this very multicultural Alexandria. I interviewed Jews and Christians and Armenians and people from European descent. And I felt that it really speaks to the point, or speaks against national narratives, right? Going back to what we were talking before. So what I'm doing now in my current projects, so I'm trying to take that experience and preparing myself for my dissertation. Again, I'm basically studying the mass migration of Syrians and Lebanese to Brazil, to a certain extent, also Palestinians and Egyptians, mostly at the turn of the 19th century to the 20th. There are some written documents, of course, passports, journals, letters, newspapers, the usual culprits, but they do tend to tell the same stories. A lot of them were produced by very specific sections, very specific groups, upper class, men, Maronite, Lebanese. Those are the stories that we have in written form. And what I'm figuring out is that by doing oral histories with descendants or first generation migrants even, we can finally access the narratives of lower class people, women, Muslims, which again, I think goes back to the idea of heteroglossia. And just to wrap up, I also think there is something to be said about creating true networks. I really felt, as I did oral history interviews, I really felt that I was establishing meaningful connections with some of the people that I was speaking with, maybe much more than I do in my work as a journalist. And I think part of it is certainly related to this approach of not just extracting information, but co-creating and sharing authority. And I'm not here to say, that oral history is better or that it's more just than journalism, but there are certainly different things. And I'm in this journey in between them. And I guess, with this, I think I'm done with the presentation. I would be glad to answer any questions that you have. But again, I just wanted to emphasize, that I'm not here as any sort of authority. What I thought it might be useful is actually kind of guiding you guys through this journey that I took, that I'm still taking. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Diogo. That was really fascinating to see you bridge different worlds and methodologies. And yes, now we have the esteemed Leila Zonouzi, who is last but not least.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Diogo. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And I'm truly, truly humbled to be among you. I keep saying that I'm not an oral historian, as I haven't been trained in either history or journalism, so I'm not as impressive as our previous speakers, but stories have been a vital part of my life. I did my undergraduate in English literature back in my home country of Iran, and my master's in creative writing, and now PhD in global studies, both in the US. And honestly, I just accidentally fell into oral history. I wanted to study the wave of migration that brought me to the US. And like in my circle of friends, almost none of my friends are back in Iran. So I knew there was something more to it. And when I found that there has been so little written about it or theorized on this phenomena, I thought, why not I do it, So I read up on the Iranian history, Egyptian history, Turkish history, because I knew there was something bigger than just me and my circle of friends. And I found so many similarities between the socio-political historic trajectories of Iran, Egypt, and Turkey, whether you want to call them nations, geopolitical locality, or the Swana region on the whole. And I found that their medias had been talking about a brain drain, even though I find this term problematic, like whose brain, elitism, but those of us who have had decent education because of our country's socialist or like welfare policies that gave us free or highly subsidized education are now leaving the country, leaving their homelands, leaving their like spending their best years, their best productive working years elsewhere in the global north, the core, the empire, whatever you want to call it. And in order to study this narrative, I thought, what better way than to reach out to my network and extended network to get in touch with those who left in the early 21st century? What better way than to get firsthand accounts of this wave of actual recent migrants and try to, theorize my own journey through this process as well. And to make sure I had a case study, I extracted migration data from Department of Homeland Security and Immigration and Citizenship Canada, the Canadian Migration Department, and the German Education Board, Education Abroad Department, and realized that there have been two waves, pulses of some sort, of migration from these countries, Iran, Egypt, and Turkey, one mainly in the 1960s to the mid-1990s, and another in the early 21st century. So I began studying what could have been the cause of this new recent wave, historically, economically, sociologically, all of it. And global studies did allow me to look into all of these disciplines, as in global studies, we don't really believe in disciplines. So the dates and numbers for all three home countries matched each other perfectly. And I wish I had prepared some of the charts that I have collected, but alas, I did not have time. And it was a clear mass migration of academics, students, faculty from Iran, Egypt, and Turkey to the global north. And in order to present this wave holistically, I scheduled interviews with recent migrants. I had originally planned to travel around the US, Canada, and possibly Germany to conduct in-person interviews, but the pandemic happened and all of my interviews went on Zoom. While positionality and coming from an American institution usually brings a certain baggage with it, and a lot of communities do harbor some mistrust. In my experience, it actually gave me more credibility and established more trust that I would not abuse the sensitive information that I was getting, and would not endanger my interlocutors, who are academics themselves, purged academics mostly, and believed in the IRB process, believed in academic integrity and the institution as a whole. And they felt secure that I told them the interviews will be anonymized and all identifiable information would be taken out. And I then began having issues soliciting Egyptian interlocutors in Canada. A few weeks later, after I made this discovery, I saw Egypt Migration's call for an oral historian intern. I read the job description, and even though I was like, I am not an oral historian, I realized that, well, this is exactly what I've been doing for the past year or so, so why not apply to it? And then I thought, if I had EM's connection to the Egyptian Canadian diaspora, and I have struck gold, because EM will have their history of recent wave of academic migration from Egypt to Canada, and I will have my dissertation goals met too. And a few months in, I realized that there is something there to discover, as even with establishing legitimacy and getting street cred, as I've multiple times told Michael, I was still having trouble soliciting interviews. Recent migrants who still had ties to the homeland were either reluctant to get in touch with me out of fear of saying something that might get them into trouble with the current government or state in Egypt, or my message was just not getting out there. I tried contacting Egyptian student associations at different Canadian schools, reached out to NGOs, etc., all of it, but I still have little to show for. I made 3 out of the 10 interviews, and believe it or not, I'm still trying to finish this task. Very unimpressive, I know. But I guess Michael saw the passion that I have to serve the diasporic communities I'm researching, including my own Iranian American community, and asked me to fill in for Mireille, our outgoing editor, and take on the editorship for Egypt Migrations. I immediately said yes, didn't even hesitate for a second. And I am learning and growing ever since then. I've gotten in touch with exceptional Egyptians and have recorded a portion of their migration journeys. I truly feel fortunate that, and I can't wait to learn more about each and every Egyptian out there. So if you're out there listening to this talk, please send me your stories. We'd love to publish your pieces on our digital cafe. I have a few other notes on like my methods and everything, but one of the things that I did to solicit interviews was just to reach out to my network and my extended network and never go public with a call because of how, as I said, recent migrants have ties to the homeland, and the questions that I ask can lean on political things, especially since we've had a lot of social movements happening, and I wanted to study how or even if those social movements and repression and all of that had like any contributing factors in their migration journey. So all of the interviews that I have done for my own project have been anonymized and all of that, but maybe through Egypt migration, one of the fears of people is that it'll be like on video and their name will be on there, but we have options. We have anonymous audio, we have anonymous transcript. So please get in touch with me and let's talk about your journey and why your migration at this time, at the time that you did, really matters and can change a lot of things for a lot of people. And yeah, with that, I wanted to share just like a little tidbit on what I've discovered about the 3 different communities that I am researching. There is a lot of similarities among us, a lot of like historical background and baggage. But something that I've noticed is that Turks and Egyptians are much more politically active than Iranians. We've been soured on politics. And I also noticed that more Egyptian men were willing to talk to me, while I had more female identifying Iranian and Turk interlocutors. So these are some of the insider tips that I found interesting and I wanted to share with you. I have other stuff about like echoing what Michael and Diogo said about taking loads and loads of notes and recording your interviews if possible, because I have realized that like when you're doing the interview, you're really hyped up and you're really excited and you tend to forget some things, and some like really tiny details come up once you are reviewing the transcript or reviewing the recording. And I always like through this process, I've learned that if this is your target subject of study, it's best for your interview to talk about everything around it as well, because you don't know where your research will take you. I initially thought that I'm going to study the effect of social movements in the 2010s on mass migration, but then realized mass migration, the second wave of academic migration, happened a little bit like a 5-year gap before the social movements that occurred. So have as many questions as you can, because you don't know what might come up. So that's me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You all of you are so inspiring. So thank you so much for sharing your experiences. I would now like to open it up to Q&A. If anyone has anything that they would like to put in the chat, or if you want to just raise your hand and go for it while maybe you think through a possible question. I think I will selfishly begin because I think, you know, like we've talked about like historians and archives, and like now we're dealing with like people. And we're always dealing with people, like even when we're in the archive, but I think all of this is like makes like all of our subjectivities really obvious, right? And so I was just wondering, and this is really, you know, directed to anyone who like wants to jump in on this, but like, how do you think maybe oral history is like a really optimal methodology for like critiquing our own interests and like positionalities, but then also getting into information that we might not otherwise get, despite how discomfortable that might be, you know, for whoever wants to go.
Well, I'll jump right in and just say that so you reminded me of something. I remember back in when I first started prepping for my interview phase, I was reading an article by Pamela Sugerman, who writes extensively on oral history and who studies the Japanese Canadian community. She wrote at one point, the unfinishedness of oral history infects all other sources. Because it's always in progress, right? Like when we deal with oral history, when we deal with memory, when we deal with remembering and forgetting, we are engaging with a process that is synchronic, that it exists in time as well as it exists over time. It's diachronic. And so in that way, we are encountering people at particular moments and gathering their stories, but they are always shifting and they are always contextual and they're always in relation to other things. And of course, all sources are unfinished and all sources have their own complexities and their own problems, but there's a certain authority that's attributed to the written word that I don't think is attributed to oral history. And it's often behind much of the criticism against oral history is from that basis, the fact that it's not deemed to be, the right kind of source for a historian. But that aside, that little bit of, anchor aside, we can say that it's that unfinishedness, that constant flux and the way that you grapple with the oral history when you're trying to write and you're trying to wrangle it and you're trying to figure out how to tell this story and how to tell this narrative. And I mean, as historians, we're not just out there recording facts and figures, we are telling stories. We were trying to produce compelling narratives with a clear argument. So it's that line has stuck with me throughout my entire career. It's that unfinishedness of oral history that infects all other sources.
Yeah, go ahead, Diogo.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that actually. And I think one of the interesting things for me is that I think oral history allows us to bridge the gap between in my case, studying migrants, between what historians or scholars are interested in and what migrants themselves are interested in. I think a lot of time when we're studying migration, we focus on stuff like integration or acculturation that are not necessarily their priorities. And I think oral history allows us to just sit down with people and ask them, tell me your story. And then you realize there's something ongoing there, or gender relations or racial hierarchies that you didn't even consider when you were coming from outside, right? And I think that's something we've been discussing a lot in the course that I'm taking at Georgetown as well, kind of just asking people, what in your story do you think it's actually important for you, right? And that's something that I would absolutely not do as a journalist. I had people that I interviewed telling me, yeah, that's interesting, but I think, what I really want you to write is about, I don't know, the sewage problem in my neighborhood. And I would be like, yeah, sure. But I'm the one who actually knows what is a lead and what's a story and what's going to interest my readers. So I'm going to take it into consideration, but I'm going to do whatever I do best, right? And I think that's really not how we do oral history, at least in my short experience.
I don't know, talk about my own experience as well. Why not? Because as you said, Amy, it absolutely, I do believe that oral history and conducting interviews is like the optimal choice for a researcher, because what you need to get and your questions, and you just directly go to the source and say, does this apply to you and how? But I also think that it's not just about the story, and it's about the persons that you're talking to, the interviews, the interlocutors as well. And even though you have your biases, you have your agenda, you need to, get to your theory and whatnot, allowing them to to make some self-discoveries along the way is really important too. So if they go off on a tangent, please allow them to do that, because it's also about how they're rediscovering their journey, their life experience through the process as well. And as Michael also talked about, not being extractive, even though like you can't help it, you are extracting information from them, and you will academically at least benefit from getting their stories, but if possible, allow for them to also benefit from what you're doing, and let them rediscover some things that they might have forgotten along the way.
I love that. Well, we do have a question in the chat from Raymar. What should you do in the case when two of your interlocutors tell you opposite stories about a subject, in which both of those stories cannot be true, and also there is no document on the subject? I like this scenario. What do you do?
Well, I'll jump in. So it's true to them, and that's what matters. When I encounter a situation like that, and especially studying the Copts, one of my biggest stumbling blocks was the fact that there wasn't much archival material. There wasn't much written on Egyptian immigration to North America, let alone, Coptic immigration within that number. And so it's really difficult to go back and, find more resources to build up the story. But your concern ultimately as an oral historian, in my view, is to critically reflect on the stories that are being presented to you, to understand why people are telling their stories the way that they are. We're not simply studying the event, but we're studying the remembering and the forgetting of that event. And those are not my words, those are Alessandro Portelli. But they tell us a great deal, because you want to understand, looking at their age, their timing of their migration, their socioeconomic status, their positioning, their ideological background, and how they perceive themselves within that community, and so on and so on and so on. You want to understand why they're telling the story the way that they are, why it matters to them to tell it the way that they are. And by gathering a large enough sample size, you try to understand who else is telling that story in that way. And if you have two opposing stories, then you have variety in terms of how the community is choosing to remember things. So why are they choosing to remember it in that way? Right? So that's my response.
Oh man, I loved it. I loved how you put it, but I also wanted to say, lean into the contradictions, lean into the paradoxes. And as you're discovering how people are remembering, a lot of people who have done coding, and because I'm trying to analyze and code my interviews through, I don't know, critical discourse analysis, grounded theory, and all of that, they all say lean into these discrepancies, because there's a story behind it, and it's your responsibility to find out that story. Because people are not like pathological liars. There's something there, and kudos to you for finding that like discrepancy, or whatever you want to call it, contradiction, and dig deeper, because you can find something that if all of your interviews are just like same across the board, where's the excitement in there,
Yeah, I just wanted to add something. I mean, I think Michael said it brilliantly. But I have one example from my research that I always think about. So if you speak with Syrian and Lebanese migrants in Brazil, even the descendants, they're going to remember, all these tales of religious persecution in the Ottoman Empire and how that was the one thing that led them to migrate, which is something historians have been arguing against. They have been showing, at least through documents, that that's not really what was happening in that one period when they started migrating to Brazil, and that's not certainly what made them migrate. There's many economic motivations. They're probably higher up than that. But the fact that they're telling the stories, and that's what God Remember, is very interesting, because it tells us about what kind of nation-making process was happening at that moment, and how Lebanese Maronites abroad were trying to shape this narrative of religious persecution, and how they understood what was expected of them in the new countries where they arrived. So again, I mean, just to echo what Michael and Leila said, just thinking of why these stories are coming up and what's behind them, I think it's actually probably the richest part of the research. But just to play devil's advocate, I'll say something in defense of written documents as well, because I was thinking about my research and how something that I've been researching a lot is this particular Syrian woman that was very active in the 10s and the 20s in Brazil. She was a nationalist. She was editing newspapers and magazines. She was kind of a leader in the community, but she got forgotten. If you speak with migrants, they actually don't know who she was. They don't remember her, basically, right? And she didn't get into this oral collective memory. And I think in this case, written documents can actually, put her back into history. So I mean, just to say that I think both things actually go hand in hand. I mean, we should be paying attention to both kind of sources.
Yeah, thank you so much for that reminder, Diogo. I think also we've been yeah, oral history. It's not that oral history is the only way or it's better. It's, I think, Michael, you were saying something to that effect earlier. It's not like it's the best. It's just, it gives us tools to know things that we may not know through other things, but we triangulate that, or we, bring all of those in. And I think that's a good reminder. All right, let's, we have another question in the chat. That is 3 parts. So are there protocols for creating the terms in the consent form? Secondly, having to share the interviews. Do you have to share the interviews after you record them with the interlocutors? And then third, about how to identify interlocutors that are related to you, assuming that they will carry bias. So 3 very good interconnected questions. If anyone wants to talk a little bit about protocol.
I could take a stab at it. Why not? I think I have been privileged enough to have the support of my school. So I went through the IRB process, which gives you a protocol and asks you some really specific questions, and allows you to think through all possible scenarios. So how does this interview affect your interlocutors? What are the risks? What are the benefits? And you need to think through all of those. And through those questions, a protocol comes up. The consent form is like a long-standing, custom, if I want to say, in academia, that the words are have been there for a while, and they just add your own specific project to it. So nothing too exciting about that. But at the same time, something that has helped me a lot in navigating the exact questions that you've asked, Salma, is friends and colleagues who have done and gone through the same process. I asked for a lot of my friends' documents. So how did you go through the IRB process? What were the questions? How were you answering them, and how can I answer them based off of my research questions? And so yeah, the protocols are there. There's nothing new that you might produce. I have told my interviewees that once I am in the process of writing and analyzing, I will share what I have with them. I will let them know how I've used the interview, and whenever I need to, I don't know, whenever I want to publish something, I will still contact them and tell them, this is what I'm trying to cite from you. Is it still accurate? Does it still speak to you? Please let me know how I can edit it if anything has changed. So I really want to give every, as I also Michael said, every authority to my interlocutors. And about friends and their biases, I have also thought through that, because a lot of the people that I know in my network are also my friends. So I was like, there has to be a level of distance, because if I talk to, for instance, I don't know, a good friend of mine who has gone through the same process, the same migration process, they would be like, oh, do you want me to talk about this and that way? Will that be helpful for your research? And I'll be like, no, I need everything. I just pretend you don't know me. And sometimes that pretend you don't know me really gets in the way of the story being accurately portrayed. So I would say, my own experience, try to refrain from getting in touch with people that know what you're trying to argue, because then they will try to say their words in a way that makes sense to your project. So the less you know the person, I mean, not their story, but the less you are, I don't know, familiar with your interlocutor, in my view, has been the best way to get their stories as accurately as I possibly can.
I just wanted to echo what Leila said. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. So the stuff is already out there. And if you are unsure about how to get started, contacting support persons for the ethical board that you are engaging with to get ethical clearance, they will provide you with references, with templates, and with instruction manuals. If you are in need of some inspiration for consent forms, email us, team@egyptmigrations.com. We use a very effective consent form, I hope, that has worked well for us so far. So I have no problem to pass it on and share and collaborate. In regards to sharing the interviews, yes. So sharing the interview is important. And as Leila added, sharing some of what you're writing as well is important to make sure that you are accurately portraying the people that you are engaged with. And I know I, for a fact, kept in constant touch with my interviewees for my dissertation. And as soon as I defended, I sent copies of my dissertation to a few of them who were willing, because it was really long. So I didn't want to force it on anyone. So it's really important to have that conversation. It's not only for the benefit of being equitable and sharing authority with the participant in the project, but it's also for doing good work, for doing good scholarly work that reflects the stories you want to tell accurately. And so it's for the benefit of everyone. And I feel like it's just such an important practice. And in terms of interviewing others or like people who are related to you, I assume bias always. You carry bias, everyone carries bias, that won't change. And familiarity, yes, absolutely, familiarity can be a stumbling block. Me personally, I did spend some time during my interview phase interviewing my family. It's not something that ended up in the final product, but it's something that I thought I wanted to write a chapter on my family history, which I worked on and then I had to cut out, but that's another story. Ultimately, I did interview family, and the best thing that worked for me personally, whether I was interviewing family or interviewing people I was meeting for the first time, is to assume nothing, to assume that you know nothing. Because when you go in and do an interview, especially as an insider, someone who is part of the community, there are these assumptions that when someone mentions Christmas or mentions what they did for Easter or mentions how they feel about, the Cairo airport, you assume things because of your own experience at these events or in these places. What's the saying? Assuming makes an ass out of you and me, right? Because it really does. You go back and you review the recordings later, and you're like, oh my God, why didn't I ask them what they did on Easter? Because every family is different, and it varies by region, and it can be. It tells you stuff, it tells you information. We're looking for context, we're looking for texture, we're looking to understand people. It's such a small example, but I think it's these small things, right? Like, don't assume anything. And so when I sat down with my uncle or my dad or my aunt, trying to gather stories about my family back, like my family's history back several generations in Upper Egypt, I really just assumed nothing, and I asked the most basic of questions, and I started from the ground up. And even stuff that I knew or stories that I'd heard as a child, I feigned ignorance because I wanted to hear them again. Because hearing them again tells me more about them, gets them recorded, which is really important, but also tells me more, it gives me different perspectives. Now time has passed, have these stories changed? And because we are working in conversation to produce this source, then my own recollections will go into the writing as I reflect critically as a scholar on the way that these stories were told and on that family history. So assume nothing, prep and draw on your networks, and don't reinvent the wheel. And reach out to us. I'm always happy for people to reach out to us.
Sorry, I wanted to add something, like a very small note as well. I started interviewing family members to get familiarized with the process of interviewing and testing out my interview questions. So that might also help you out. I realized that I had 10 questions, and realized I needed to add 10 more out of the conversation I had with my family members. I realized that the story is only half. It's like the half of the story, and there needs to be more about it. So try it out.
Well, I really think that was an amazing conversation, and I'm so grateful to everyone who came to spend a Friday in April with us, our last installment. And I think the speakers for sharing from their own experiences and just being so honest and transparent. May we also conduct oral histories as you have done so for us. And thank you everyone so much for being here.